Why are you here today, of all days?
Because they stole your family from you.
You sold my mother's house. You don't understand what I protected you from. Then explain the missing 400,000.
Your father saved 2 people that night.
He never told me. I know who I come from now.
The man in the pickup truck had been there since 7 in the morning. He had a travel mug of black coffee, a manila folder on the passenger seat, and no invitation. By 9, the florists had gone around him twice. By 10, the parking attendants had asked him to move to the service lane, and he had said politely that he was fine where he was. By 11, 3 separate guests had taken photographs of the truck and posted them with captions that used the words "crasher" and "scene." Nobody thought to ask what he was waiting for. They already knew. Men who looked like him waited for checks or instructions. They did not wait for brides. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The morning Nora Callahan was supposed to get married, she woke up at 5:30 with the particular stillness of a woman who has not slept. The bridal suite at Whitmore Estate had high ceilings and a window that looked out over the garden, where 200 chairs had been arranged in perfectly straight rows since the day before. Nora sat on the edge of the bed in her robe and watched the groundskeepers move through the early light, adjusting something in the centerpiece arrangements that looked fine to her from where she sat. Maybe it was fine. Maybe everything was fine. She had been telling herself this for approximately 6 months. Her maid of honor Pam arrived at 7 with coffee, and the kind of careful brightness that people use when they're not sure how the bride is feeling. Nora accepted the coffee and smiled in the right places while Pam talked about hair appointments and the florist's delivery window and whether the string quartet had confirmed the arrival time. Nora said yes, and of course, and that sounds right. She had become very good at that particular kind of listening. By 10 o'clock, she was in the dress. It was ivory structured, chosen partly because Brett's mother had suggested it would photograph beautifully. Margaret Caldwell was a woman who thought about how things photographed. Nora had been photographing well for almost 2 years. The hired car arrived at 10:15. Pam straightened Nora's veil while the driver loaded the small bag with touch-up items into the trunk. Nora looked at herself in the full-length mirror one last time, not checking exactly. More like asking. The woman in the mirror did not answer. The drive to Whitmore Estate took 20 minutes. Nora watched the city give way to the manicured green of the outer districts, the road widening past gated driveways and old stone walls. She had been to the estate 3 times for planning meetings. Each time she had told herself that the strangeness she felt was nerves. That was a reasonable explanation, and she had used it efficiently. They turned onto the estate's approach road. Through the windshield, she could see the gatehouse ahead, and beyond it, the long drive lined with guests arriving in order sedans and SUVs and one town car that she recognized as Margaret Caldwell's. They were all moving smoothly in the same direction, the way things move when they have been well organized. Then she saw the truck. It was parked just outside the gate on the gravel verge of Ford F-150 that was maybe 12 years old, the kind of truck that had been worked hard and not replaced because there was no reason to replace something that still ran. The tailgate had a dent in it. The driver's side mirror had a small crack running across one corner. It sat there with the solid indifference of something that belonged exactly where it was, even though everyone passing it clearly felt otherwise. A parking attendant was speaking to the man leaning against the driver's door. The man was wearing dark Carhartt work pants and a blue flannel shirt that had been pressed, which was an interesting detail. He'd taken care with it, even if the shirt itself was not what you wore to a wedding like this one. His hands were around a travel mug. He was listening to the parking attendant with the patience of someone who has nothing to prove and all morning to wait. Nora's driver slowed for the gate. She saw the man's face. She said, "Stop the car." The driver looked in the rearview mirror. Ma'am, please stop the car." The car stopped on the approach road 10 yards from the gate. 2 guests on foot turned to look. Nora opened the door herself before the driver could get around to it, and she stepped out onto the gravel in her ivory dress and the heels that were already starting to press wrong on the balls of her feet, and she walked toward the gate. The parking attendant noticed her first. His face did something complicated. The man by the truck had already seen her. He had not moved. He was not the kind of person who made sudden movements. Nora walked past the gate attendant, past the low stone pillar with the estate's carved name on it, and she stopped 6 feet in front of him. She could feel the attention of everyone on the approach road behind her. She didn't turn around. He held out the folder. She took it. She opened it to the first page. It was a real estate deed, the standard county format, legal descriptions and lot numbers, and the parties' names typed in the boxes at the top. She saw her family's address on the second line. She saw the sale date printed below it. 6 weeks after her mother's funeral. Someone behind her said loud enough to carry, "Does anyone know who that man is?" Nora did not look up from the page. Caleb Denton said very little at first. He waited while Nora read the first page and then the second, which was a trust account statement. She had to read the bottom line twice. The statement showed a current balance of $47,000. The trust had been established to hold her parents' life insurance payout. She had been told 6 years ago and several times since that there was almost nothing left. She looked up from the folder. "How did you find this?" he explained, unhurried, while the world behind her continued to arrive in expensive cars and move through the gate with the momentum of a well-planned event. He had started a development project 3 months ago, a mixed-use parcel outside the city about 1.5 miles from her family's old address. The county records search for adjacent properties had surfaced the deed. He had looked at the sale date and the price and the name of the trustee, and then he had looked at the trust filing, which was public record, if you knew which county office to call, which he did, because he called 6 of them. "You called 6 county offices," she said. 4 were the wrong ones. She looked back at the folder. $285,000 for the house. $47,000 remaining in a trust that should have had at minimum several times that. "You said it was the trustee's name that flagged it. Diane Hayes." "I looked her up to see if she was a professional trustee. She isn't." Nora's phone vibrated in the small bag she was holding. She glanced at the screen. "Brett." She silenced it. "Nora." His voice was careful. "You don't have to stand here. If you need to go back, I don't." She said it before she understood why. Then she said, "How much was originally in the trust?" "Do you know I need a few more phone calls to confirm?" But the original policy was large. The kind of policy people take out when they have a paid-off home and 2 incomes and no dependents left to worry about. She closed the folder. She held it at her side. "She told me there was nothing left. After the debts and the legal fees. She said the estate had been." She stopped. She had said these words so many times in 6 years that they had become smooth, like stone worn by water. She said there was almost nothing. Caleb didn't say anything. Behind her, a car door closed. Then Brett's voice coming from the direction of the venue steps, not walking toward her, calling to her. "Nora. The efficient needs to go over a few things." His tone was the particular kind of composed that had taken her months to recognize as its own form of pressure. It sounded like patience. It was management. She turned and looked at him across the gate. He was standing with his hands in the pockets of his morning coat, the picture of a man waiting for a reasonable resolution to a minor inconvenience. She called back. I need an hour. A pause. The schedule. An hour, Brett. He looked at the man beside her, then at her. Something crossed his face that she didn't have time to read. He went back inside. Margaret Caldwell appeared at the top of the steps. She stood there with the stillness of a woman who had managed other people's situations for decades. She looked at Nora, and then at Caleb. And then she said something to the man standing beside her. Nora couldn't hear it, and turned and went back inside. Nora looked at Caleb. His expression hadn't changed through any of it. He had the face of someone who had been expecting this morning to go exactly this way, and had made his peace with all possible outcomes in advance. Why today, she asked. Why come today specifically? He thought about it for a moment. I didn't know how much time you had, he said. If the wedding happened and you found out after he stopped. I didn't know how much time you had. The morning air was warm for early fall. Somewhere inside the venue, the string quartet was running through something she recognized as the processional. She had chosen it herself 4 months ago, sitting in Margaret Caldwell's living room, while Margaret made suggestions and Nora selected from them. We haven't spoken in 2 years, she said. I know. You came anyway. I had information you deserved to have. He said it plainly, like a fact about the weather. What you did with it wasn't mine to decide. She looked at the folder in her hand, then at the gate, then at the venue steps, now empty, the string quartet still running through her processional inside. She thought about the woman who had told her there was nothing left, who had sat across from her at a kitchen table 6 years ago, and said very gently that the estate had been eaten up, that these things happened, that Nora should focus on moving forward. She hung up on me, Nora said. Caleb waited. Just now. I called her from the car when I was looking at the deed on my phone. I told her the deed showed $285,000. She said, "Who told you that?" And then she hung up. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think you should talk to an attorney. You know one, she handled the property acquisition. She's good. Nora put the folder under her arm. She breathed in slowly and then out. Everything around her was still moving, a late guest hurrying through the gate, a catering van pulling around to the service entrance. The sound of the processional now shifting to something she recognized as the wrong piece, which meant someone inside was beginning to worry about timing. I'm going to go in, she said. I need to buy some time without saying why. He nodded. I'll call you when I'm out. She looked at him directly, the way she had always been able to with him and almost never with anyone else. Don't leave. I'm not going anywhere, he said. She walked back through the gate and into the estate. She was aware of every person watching her. She kept her face very still and her step very even, and she carried the folder against her side like it weighed nothing, even though her hands were shaking. Behind her, the truck did not move. The bridal suite had a lock on the door, and Nora used it. Pam had come looking for her twice, once to tell her that the officiant had questions about the ring exchange, and once just to check in, the gentle way Pam did things, whether everything was all right. Nora had answered yes through the door both times. Pam knew her well enough to know when yes meant something else. She hadn't pushed. Nora sat on the small upholstered bench at the foot of the bed, with the folder open across her lap, and her phone in her hand. The trust statement was on top now. She had reread it 3 times. The management fee line was the one she kept returning to. For this filing year, it read $46,200. She thought about what that meant. More than 3 times the cost of her first apartment. Gone in a single year's management. And this was a trust that held money for her managed on her behalf, for her benefit. She had never seen a management fee line in any document Diane had sent her, because Diane had never sent her anything except the annual summary she generated herself. She called Diane. It rang 4 times, then Nora. The warmth in her aunt's voice was immediate and practiced. "Honey, I heard you stepped out. Is everything okay? I need to ask you something about the estate." A brief pause, barely a quarter second. The kind of pause a person who has been ready for a question still cannot fully suppress. "Of course. What's going on?" The trust statement shows $47,000 remaining. It also shows management fees of $46,000 this year alone. "I want to understand the full accounting." The silence this time was longer. "Where did you get a trust statement, Diane? How much was in the trust when it was established?" "Nora, honey, I don't know where you're getting this information, but whoever told you, I'm looking at a county record, a trust filing. How much was in it?" A different kind of pause. Not thinking, deciding. After the estate debts, the legal costs, the mortgage settlement. By the time everything was settled, the trust was set at. She was mid-sentence when Nora said it. "The deed shows a sale for $285,000. The house had no mortgage. My parents owned it outright." The line went silent. Then Diane said, "Who told you that?" and hung up. Nora lowered the phone. She looked at the wall in front of her flocked wallpaper in pale gold, the kind of detail that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She thought about the kitchen table where Diane had sat with her 6 years ago, the week after the second funeral when Nora was 26 and hadn't slept properly in a month. The way Diane had explained it so carefully and so gently that these things got complicated estates were not simple. There were fees and obligations Nora didn't know about, and the important thing was that Nora was not going to be in debt, that Diane had made sure of that. She had been grateful. She had been so grateful. Her phone buzzed. A text from Caleb's insurance policy was originally for $10,000, issued 2019. Trust established same year. Current balance $47K. That's a 6-year drawdown of $363,000. She read it twice. Then she opened her email archive and searched for Diane's name. She had 6 annual summary emails, 1 per year, each arriving in February. She had opened the first one that first year when she was too numb to understand what she was reading. She had not opened the other 5. She opened the most recent one now. The document was 2 pages. Line items she had never been shown before. Administrative costs. Legal review, annual CPA review, trustee compensation, miscellaneous management. The numbers added to $47,800 for that year, against a trust that she now knew had started at $10,000. She did the math on her phone. If the drawdown had been consistent, it probably hadn't. It was likely front-loaded. But if it had been consistent, that was roughly $60,000 per year for 6 years. For a trust that by any standard interpretation existed to hold money until she needed it. She became aware that she was sitting very still. Not from calm. From the particular quality of stillness that comes when you're trying to hold a very large thing in place while you figure out what to do with it. There was a knock at the door. Not Pam this time. The knock was firmer, with the authority of someone who expected the door to open. Nora. Brett. The officiant is asking for a revised timeline. Can we talk for a moment? She stood. She smoothed the front of her dress by reflex. She put the folder behind a pillow on the settee near the window and opened the door. Brett was in his morning coat, well composed, a small line of concern between his brows that looked appropriate for the situation. She had spent almost 2 years learning his expressions. This one she recognized as the one he used when a meeting wasn't going as planned. "I need a little more time," she said. "The venue has a hard out at Brett." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I'm having a family issue. I need time to make a phone call. An hour, maybe less." He studied her for a moment. Something in his face shifted in a way she couldn't fully name, not concern exactly. More like recalibration. "Is this about the man outside?" He kept his voice very even. "Because I can have someone, it has nothing to do with him." This was not entirely true. "I need to deal with a family matter. Please give me an hour." He held her eyes for one more second. Then he nodded once and said, "I'll tell the officiant 45 minutes. He said it like a concession. He turned and walked back down the hallway. Nora closed the door. She retrieved the folder from behind the pillow. She opened her email and found the first annual summary from 6 years ago, the one she had opened once and then never looked at again. The first line item for management fees was $44,400. Year 1, $44,400. In the first year. She sat down again very slowly. Outside the window, the string quartet had stopped playing. The 200 chairs in the garden were full of people waiting for something to begin. She found the service exit at the back of the venue, a plain door near the catering staging area that nobody was watching, because everyone who worked there had a more important task. She went through it and sat down on the concrete steps in her dress heels, still on folder in her lap, the sound of the string quartet starting again, muffled through the estate walls. She called Caleb. He answered on the first ring. "Are you still outside?" she said. "Yes," she breathed out. "How did you find the insurance policy?" "The original amount, the trust filing references, the policy by number. The policy is issued through a state-licensed insurer, which means it has a public filing with the insurance commissioner. Not the full terms, but the coverage amount and the designated beneficiary." "Who was the designated beneficiary?" He said. "Through the trust." She looked at the stone path that led from the service steps to the catering van parking area. Someone had left a clipboard on the ground. "Caleb, did you know when you came today, did you know it was bad?" He was quiet for a moment. "I thought it was probably not good. I wanted you to have the information." Before a pause. "I wanted you to have the information." That was the thing about him. He had always been exactly that careful about the line between telling her and deciding for her. She had met him at a company barbecue 7 years ago, back when his company was 4 employees and a leased van, and a reputation for doing residential renovation work well and on time. She had been impressed, not by his ambition, which was considerable, but by the way he talked about it without performance, without the salesmanship that most people brought to a conversation about their own work. He said what he did. He said what he wanted to build. He said what he was still figuring out. That was all. They had been together for 4 years before her parents died. He had been in the hospital waiting room during the first 1 and the second 3 months later. He had driven her to the attorney's office when the estate proceedings started. He had sat in the parking lot and waited for 2 hours while she was inside. And when she came out and couldn't explain what had been said in there, except that it was a lot and very fast, and she was very tired, he had driven her home and made dinner from whatever was in the refrigerator and not asked her to explain anything else. 8 months after the second funeral, Diane had started the conversations. Not all at once. Diane was never direct about the things that mattered to her. She was indirect in the way that water is indirect, finding the path of least resistance and following it until it had made a channel you didn't notice until it was there. The first conversation was about stability. Nora needed stability right now. That made sense. The second was about Caleb's company, still growing, still leveraged, the kind of business where one bad quarter could mean difficult decisions. I'm sure he's wonderful, honey. I just want you to be safe. The third was a question she asked, and then immediately walked back. Is he the kind of man who would know what to do if something went wrong? Not with the business with you. She had said it lightly and then said, never mind, she just worried. By the fourth conversation, Nora had started to hear the question differently. Not what Diane was asking, but what she was planting. The idea that Nora was vulnerable, that her parents' deaths had left her exposed in ways she couldn't manage on her own. That what she needed was security, and that security looked a specific way: steady income, established position, someone who was already there rather than still building toward there. She had broken the engagement by email. She had written it 3 times and sent the second draft because it was the most honest. She told herself she was making a practical decision. She had been making practical decisions for 8 months. One more seemed reasonable. She had not spoken to Caleb in 2 years. She told me the estate was almost gone, she said now. I believed her. I was 26, and I'd just buried both my parents, and I believed her. I know. Why didn't you? She stopped. She had almost said, why didn't you fight harder? Which was unfair, and she knew it. He had called twice in the first month after the email. She had not answered. He had sent 1 letter handwritten, which she had read, and then put in a box she no longer knew the location of. He had stopped after that, because he was the kind of person who understood that some choices had to be left alone. You were told you had nothing, he said. When you have nothing, you stop taking risks. She sat with that for a moment. The service steps were uncomfortable, but she didn't move. She was thinking about Diane at the kitchen table. How warm she had been. How specifically, usefully warm, the kind of warmth that answers questions before you know to ask them. She manufactured it, Nora said. The vulnerability. She told me the estate was gone, and then she told me you were a risk. And because the first thing seemed true, the second thing felt like common sense, he said. Yes, the side door of the estate opened. Brett appeared in the doorway. He saw her on the steps with the phone pressed to her ear, and his face went through several things in quick succession: relief that she was still there, something she now recognized as calculation, and then the composed concern he had pulled back over everything else by the time his eyes met hers. He didn't walk toward her. He held up his phone, a gesture that meant he was calling her. A moment later, her phone buzzed with his name on the screen. She said to Caleb, he's here. I have to go. A pause. Don't go anywhere. I'm not. She ended the call and answered Brett's. He said, the efficient is only available until 1:30. I need to know what we're doing, Nora. Not unkind, but very clear about what the priorities were. She looked at him through the doorway. The morning coat. The careful composure. The expression she had spent 2 years learning to read and had only recently started to recognize accurately. Brett, she said. Give me 20 minutes. I'll come find you. He looked at the phone she was holding, at the folder, at her. Then he nodded and went back inside. She sat on the concrete steps in her wedding dress for a few minutes longer. She thought about a woman who had sat at a kitchen table 6 years ago and told her that the money was gone, who had asked nothing obvious in return, who had only shaped the story carefully, the way you shape something wet before it dries. Nora stood up and smoothed the dress and went back in through the service door. She needed 20 minutes. Then she was going to need a lawyer. Sandra Webb's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that did not look like the kind of place where cases worth hundreds of thousands of dollars were quietly dismantled and rebuilt. The furniture in the waiting room was serviceable. The magazines were 6 months old. Sandra herself was wearing reading glasses pushed up on her head when they came in, and she had a half-eaten sandwich on the corner of her desk that she moved to the credenza without comment. Caleb had called ahead from the estate. Nora had changed in the venue's restroom into the clothes she had worn there that morning, a navy dress she'd brought for the rehearsal dinner the night before, which she'd ended up not needing because the dinner had been canceled for weather. She had folded the wedding dress with more care than the situation probably required and left it in a garment bag at the venue's coat check. She had not explained to anyone where she was going, except that there was a family emergency and she needed to handle it. Pam had looked at her with the expression of someone who understood more than she was saying. Nora had hugged her at the door and said she would call. Sandra reviewed the 2 documents, the deed and the trust statement, while Nora and Caleb sat across from her. She did not look up from the papers while she asked questions. How long had Diane Hayes been serving as trustee? 6 years. Had Nora ever received the original trust instrument? No. Had she received the annual accountings? She had received annual summaries in email. Had she reviewed them? She had opened the first one 6 years ago. She had not reviewed the others. Sandra looked up at that. She did not make a face. She wrote something on her legal pad. Had Nora ever been provided with the power of attorney document? She had signed something in the first weeks after her mother's death, a stack of papers that an attorney had presented as routine estate administration. She had not received copies of everything she signed. Sandra wrote more. When your mother was hospitalized, Sandra said, do you know whether she remained at the same facility through the end? She was at St. Mary's for about a month and a half. The last 2 weeks they transferred her to a palliative care floor. Nora paused. She didn't really, toward the end, she wasn't very aware of where she was. The medication was heavy. Sandra set down her pen. She looked at the trust statement again. The deed of sale shows an execution date of approximately 3 months after your mother's death. The POA would have been used to authorize that sale, someone acting in your mother's name. To obtain the POA, your mother would have needed to sign it herself, or a court would have needed to appoint a guardian. The POA in an estate filing is a matter of public record. I can pull it. She looked at Nora. But I need you to understand what I'm looking for before I do, Nora said. You're looking to see when she signed it? Yes. And whether she could have? Yes. The office was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone was running a floor wax machine in the hallway, a long, steady sound like breathing. Pull it, Nora said. Sandra typed for 45 seconds. Then she stopped. Her expression did not change. She was clearly a person who had trained herself not to react visibly to documents, but something in the set of her shoulders shifted by a fraction. The POA signing date, she said, is listed as 11 days before your mother's death. Nora heard that and felt it move through her the way cold water moves when you swallow it. Not painful, but registering everything on the way down. 11 days. 2 weeks into the palliative floor. The heavy medication. Not aware of where she was. She was sedated, Nora said. The last 2 weeks. That's what I need the medical records to confirm. Sandra made another note. If the medical records show she was not competent to execute a legal document on that date, the POA is contestable. If the POA is contested and voided the sale of the house, executed under that POA is also contestable, Caleb said quietly. And the trust. The trust is a separate filing, but an overlapping matter. The POA gave Diane authority to act as trustee. If that authority was invalid from inception, everything done under it is subject to review. Sandra put the pen down. Miss Callahan, this is going to take time, and it is going to be contested. Diane Hayes will retain counsel. I understand. The first step is a petition to the probate court, accompanied by a request for the hospital records. I can file the petition as early as tomorrow. The records request will take 2 to 3 weeks to process. After that, we will know what we're dealing with. She folded her hands. I should tell you before we go further that this process will become public record. If there is a court proceeding, which I expect there will be, it will be findable. Nora thought about Diane's face across the kitchen table 6 years ago. The warmth, the careful gentleness. She thought about the kitchen she had grown up in, the one that had been in that house that was gone, now sold on the basis of a document her mother may not have understood she was signing. File it, she said. Sandra nodded once and reached for her notepad. Nora's phone vibrated. Brett. She looked at the screen and then set the phone face down on the arm of the chair. Outside the floor, wax machine moved on down the hallway. One more question, Sandra said, not looking up from what she was writing. Do you have any of the original estate documents, the probate filing, the trust instrument itself, anywhere? No, I was never sent them. Sandra paused her writing. She looked at Nora over the top of her glasses. She administered a 6-year trust and never transmitted the governing documents to the beneficiary. No, that alone, Sandra said carefully, is a breach of fiduciary duty. She went back to writing. We have more to work with than I initially thought. Nora looked at Caleb. He was watching the attorney with the focused attention of a man who had been sitting with this information for weeks and was relieved to see it in the right hands at last. He caught Nora's eye and gave a slight, careful nod. She had nothing left, and then she had less. That was what she had been told. That was what she had believed. And it had made her into the kind of person who didn't take risks, who moved in the direction people needed her to move, who sat in a living room and selected a processional from someone else's suggestions. She put her phone in her bag. She picked up her copy of the folder. She was not that person anymore, or she was trying very hard to be less of her. She went back to the venue that afternoon. She told herself it was to collect her things, which was true. It was also, she knew, because she needed to finish understanding what she was leaving, and you couldn't finish understanding something if you drove away from it before you saw it clearly. Margaret Caldwell was in the venue's main reception room when Nora arrived, speaking with the event coordinator in the low, direct way that Margaret spoke with everyone as though every conversation were a project to be managed efficiently. The 200 chairs in the garden were still set. Someone would have to deal with them. Nora did not intend it to be her. Margaret noticed her at the doorway and excused herself from the coordinator with the kind of smoothness that never showed the effort. Nora. Her voice was warm. Margaret's warmth was something Nora had always found slightly aspirational. It was so complete and so consistent that it seemed like a skill you could develop through practice, like a second language. Come sit with me. Can I get you anything? I'm just picking up a few things. Of course. Margaret guided her to a seat anyway, the way she guided everything with such light inevitability that you were already in the chair before you'd decided to sit down. I want you to know that we understand. Whatever you're going through, this isn't a reflection of anything. We all have days when things surface that we weren't expecting. Nora sat. She looked at Margaret, her posture, her face, the careful architecture of her concern. She thought about Sandra's office, the probate petition that would be filed tomorrow morning. She said, "When Brett mentioned me to you for the first time, what was your reaction?" Margaret's expression didn't change, which was itself a kind of answer. "I thought he'd found someone remarkable." "When was that?" "Oh, he mentioned he'd read about you in a brief pause. There was a piece in a business publication. Young professionals in their fields. He came to me quite excited." Nora nodded slowly. "He read about me first. He thought you were impressive." He was right. And what was impressive about the piece? Margaret settled back slightly. The warmth remained, but underneath it something sharpened almost imperceptibly. Your background, Nora, what you'd built, coming from the circumstances you came from, it's genuinely admirable. The circumstances, Nora said. You mean that I'm an orphan, that I don't come from money, that I built what I have with no family support. I mean that you've shown real character. Associated with, Nora said. Margaret tilted her head. You told me a few weeks before the engagement that my story meant something to your family, that it was the kind of resilience you wanted to be associated with. Nora kept her voice level. I thought it was a nice thing to say. I'm realizing now it was a description of a strategy. Margaret was quiet for a moment. A very brief moment. Families like ours have a public dimension that, the labor lawsuit. 2 years ago, the settlement was significant, a pause. We were pleased to reach a resolution. You needed a counter-narrative. A son who chose a woman with nothing, who built herself up, who had overcome something. It makes the family look a certain way. Nora watched Margaret's face. Did Brett choose me, or did he meet me? The silence that followed was the most honest thing Margaret had said since Nora walked in. Brett appeared in the doorway. He had changed out of the morning coat into something more casual. He looked at Nora, and then at his mother, and his expression did the thing it did, moved through several versions of itself, before settling into the composed one. Can I talk to you? He said to Nora. Nora stood. Yes. They went to a smaller sitting room off the main hall. Brett closed the door. He stood with his hands in his pockets, which was the stance he took when he was being careful about what he said. I need to understand what's happening, he said. There's a problem with my family's estate. I'm dealing with it. With a man who waited outside our wedding in a work truck. He had information I needed. Brett considered this. Who is he? Someone I knew before you. Another consideration. He was very good at this, at waiting, at letting the space of a conversation do the work he didn't want to do himself. She had found this quality attractive for a long time. She wasn't sure when she had started finding it cold. Did you know him well? Yes. He nodded slowly. Nora. I want this to work. I want to understand what you need. The words were right. The words were always right with Brett. It was the thing behind the words, the way they always felt like an opening position, rather than a feeling that she had learned to read. But I need you to be honest with me about what's happening. I am being honest with you. My aunt has been managing my parents' estate fraudulently for 6 years. I found out this morning. I'm handling it. He absorbed this. That's serious. Yes. Do you need, he gestured vaguely, resources? I can connect you with Brett. She said it quietly. Did you know about the labor lawsuit when you asked me out? He was still for a moment. Then my mother mentioned there had been a period of bad press, that it might help to. He stopped. To be associated with someone who wasn't from that world, she said. He looked at her. He did not deny it. He said, I thought you'd be a good fit. He said it like that was a full answer. Like fit was a thing two people could be for each other, and have that be enough. She picked up her bag from the chair. I thought I was going to marry someone who needed me, she said. Not someone who needed what I represented. He said nothing. He watched her go. She found her way back through the main hall, past the empty chairs and the wilting centerpieces, and the white canopy that had been put up over the garden at considerable expense. Margaret was on the phone at the far end of the room. She didn't look up. Nora walked out through the front entrance. The parking lot was quieter now. Most of the guests had gone hours ago. Caleb's truck was in the visitor area near the entrance. He was leaning against the driver's side door, still there exactly as she'd left him. She crossed the parking lot toward him. She wasn't crying. She wasn't sure why she had expected to be. "Tell me about the attorney," she said. "What she's like to work with." He straightened up. He read her face and did not ask about Brett, which was right. "She's thorough," he said. "She doesn't move fast, but she doesn't miss things." Good. Nora looked at the estate behind her one more time. The white canopy. The 200 empty chairs. Because I'm done moving fast. The medical records took 3 weeks. Sandra filed the emergency request the morning after Nora came to her office, citing the pending probate petition as grounds for expedited review. The hospital's legal department required a secondary authorization. Sandra provided it. Then there was a processing queue and a records management system that apparently operated on a timeline calibrated for people who were not in a hurry. Sandra told Nora to be patient. Nora was patient the way you are patient when the alternative is doing something that would make things worse. She went back to work. She answered emails and sat in HR review meetings and ate lunch at her desk and told anyone who asked that the wedding had been postponed, which was technically accurate in the way that a lot of things she had said in the past 6 years were technically accurate while being substantially incomplete. Pam texted twice. Nora called her back the second time and told her enough to explain the shape of what had happened without going into the parts that were still moving. Pam said, "Are you okay?" Nora said, "I'm making a list of things I should have looked at 6 years ago." Pam said, "That's not really what I asked." Nora said, "I know. I'm okay. I'm just in it." When the records came, Sandra called her in on a Tuesday morning. The folder was on the desk when Nora arrived, and Sandra's glasses were on her face rather than pushed up on her head, which Nora had come to understand meant the situation was specific and required precision. The records covered Sandra Callahan's final 40 days. The admissions notes documented her presentation on arrival. The daily nursing assessments tracked the progression. And in the section covering the week that included the POA signing date, the nursing note for that day read, "Patient comfortable. Palliative sedation protocol day 9. Not oriented to time or place. Family visited in afternoon." Not oriented to time or place, Nora said. That is a clinical notation, meaning she did not have awareness of her temporal and physical circumstances, Sandra said. In a medical context, it effectively means she was not competent to execute a legal document. Nora looked at the date on the note. The date the POA had been signed according to the county record was the following afternoon. So whoever was there, she said, either got her to sign it when she was in this condition or the signature was not hers. Sandra had clearly been thinking about both possibilities for the past 20 minutes. We can pursue a handwriting analysis of the signature on the POA itself, comparing it to authenticated samples of your mother's signature. If the comparison shows inconsistency, that's additional grounds. She looked at Nora. But the medical record alone is enough to establish that your mother could not have meaningfully consented to execute a power of attorney on that date. That is the linchpin. Nora looked at the nursing note again. Palliative sedation protocol day 9. Her mother had been 9 days into a sedation protocol when someone somehow had obtained her signature on a document that allowed them to sell her house and manage her money. "Can I have a copy?" she said. "Of course. These are your mother's records." Nora took the copy. She folded it and put it in her bag. She did not cry in Sandra's office, which she had expected herself to do. She had been expecting emotion to arrive in a clean wave, and it kept not arriving that way. It came instead in small increments at odd times in the middle of normal things, so that she would be in a meeting at work and suddenly have to breathe very deliberately for about 30 seconds before she could continue. She called Caleb from the parking lot standing beside her car. "The records confirm it," she said. She was on palliative sedation. She wasn't oriented to time or place. Whoever got that signature got it from a woman who didn't understand where she was. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't think she signed it at all. Sandra thinks it could be either." "I know. But your mother—" He stopped. "Then I only met her twice. But I think you know which one it was." She did know. She had known since she saw the date on the nursing note, the same way she had known looking at the trust statement the previous month. Her mother had been meticulous and careful, and she had known the weight of that house, what it had cost, what it meant. She would not have signed it away. Not for any reason, and certainly not in a condition where she might not even have understood what she was being asked to sign. "How did you start your company?" Nora said. She didn't know exactly why she was asking, except that she needed something that had nothing to do with what was in the folder. "Roofing," he said. "3 of us, 1 truck, about $40,000 in startup costs. My father co-signed the equipment loan. What happened to the truck?" A slight pause. "It's the one that was outside your wedding." She almost laughed. "You kept it. It works. And my father used to say," he was quiet for a second. "He used to say you can tell who somebody is by what they do when nobody's watching." She held that. Her mother had been alone in a hospital bed, sedated, not oriented to time or place. Nobody would have been watching. Somebody had done something anyway. "I need to go back inside," she said. "Sandra wants to talk about the next steps." "Okay. Caleb," she paused. "Thank you for coming. He said you would have found this eventually. Not before she stopped. Not before the wedding. Not before a life built on a story that someone else had written for her. Maybe," she said, "but not yet." When she went back and Sandra's receptionist said that a woman named Diane Hayes had come in while she was on the phone outside. She had stood in the lobby and asked to speak to Nora. She had been told that all communication should go through counsel. She had stood there for a moment longer and then left. Sandra appeared in the doorway. "Are you ready?" Nora put her phone in her bag. "Yes," she said. She went in and they got to work. The probate petition was filed the second week of October. Sandra sent Nora the confirmation number and a copy of the filed documents, and a note that said, "Now we wait for the court's scheduling order and the discovery process to begin." She also sent a list of documents she needed from Nora, every piece of correspondence from Diane about the estate, every bank statement Nora had for accounts that had ever received estate funds, and every document she had signed in the first year after her parents' deaths. It took Nora 4 evenings to pull everything together. She had more than she'd expected. She had kept paper records of things without entirely understanding why, the way people from careful households sometimes do, putting things in folders even when they weren't sure what the folders were for. There were signed acknowledgement forms from the original estate attorney, a letter from Diane explaining why the estate proceedings had taken longer than expected, and 3 voicemails she had saved on an old phone. She had kept the phone in a box in her closet because there were messages from her mother on it that she had not been able to delete. She did not listen to her mother's messages. She charged the phone, sent the voicemail files to herself as audio attachments, and then boxed the phone back up. She was at Sandra's office on a Thursday afternoon, going through the documents with a paralegal, when Sandra came in and said there was something she needed to see. An email had come in through counsel from Ray Hayes. He had apparently retained his own attorney separate from Diane's, a detail Sandra noted with professional appreciation. Ray's attorney wrote that Mr. Hayes wished to clarify his role in the estate administration. He co-signed certain financial documents related to the trust. Diane had presented them to him as routine trust administration paperwork. He had not been informed of the full nature of the transactions those documents authorized. He was not in a position to speak to his wife's intent. He could, however, confirm specific dates and his own signatures. Nora read the email twice. He knew something was wrong, she said. He knew enough to have made different choices, Sandra agreed. But he's not standing behind her. That's significant. She folded her hands. Diane's attorney has not been in touch with us, which means either she hasn't retained one yet, or she has, and they're being quiet. Bremer's firm, Carl Bremer, he specializes in trust and estate litigation defense, represented someone in a similar case 2 years ago and ran a very effective delay strategy. She paused. If it's Bremer, we should expect complications. What kind of complications? He will challenge the medical expert's interpretation of the nursing notes. He'll argue that not oriented to time or place is a clinical descriptor that doesn't carry the legal weight we're assigning it. He'll try to establish that Diane acted in good faith based on the authority she understood herself to have. He may try to depose you extensively. She said it plainly without apology. You should be prepared to be asked about your relationship with the person who gave you the initial documents. He will try to make this about motivation. Nora looked out the window. The city below was mid-afternoon, ordinary people walking traffic, a delivery truck double-parked outside a restaurant. He'll say Caleb has a motive to interfere. He may. Because of our history. Possibly. We'll get ahead of it. Sandra picked up her pen. Tell me about him. Not personally. What he does, how he came to be involved, the exact sequence from when he found the deed to when he came to the venue. Nora told it in order. Caleb had found the deed through a county record search on an adjacent parcel. He cross-referenced the trust. He spent several weeks verifying what the records showed before he came to her. He came because she had a right to the information, and because he didn't know how much time she had. And he has no claim on the estate, Sandra said. None. No financial interest in her aunt's situation. None. And the documents he provided, the deed and the trust statement, are county public records that anyone could have pulled. Yes. Sandra wrote for a moment. Good. That's a clean chain of custody. She looked up. I'm going to need him to be available to speak with me if we need to address the discovery question. Will that be a problem? Nora thought about Caleb leaning against the truck that morning. The patience of him. The unhurried way he had handed over the folder and stepped back. No, she said. It won't be a problem. She left Sandra's office at 5:30. Walking to her car, she found herself thinking about the first year after her parents died, the way time had moved then in patches of ordinary life and sudden, blunt grief. The estate proceedings had been part of the ordinary patches meetings with an attorney. She didn't know forms she signed because they were put in front of her by someone she trusted, explanations she received, and couldn't fully process because she was 26 and exhausted, and Diane was there, always there, managing the parts that Nora could not manage. She had trusted Diane because Diane was the person who showed up. That was all it had taken. Not virtue, not love, presence. The willingness to be in the room when someone needed a room to be in. She had broken her engagement to a man she'd loved for 4 years, because Diane had made herself the most present person in Nora's life. And being most present, she had been most believed. Nora sat in her car for a few minutes without starting it. She thought about the nursing note. Palliative sedation protocol, day 9. Not oriented to time or place. Her mother had been 10 days from dying, and someone had been in that room with a document. She started the car. That night, she found a handwritten letter from her father in the folder of old documents she had pulled together for Sandra. A birthday card he had sent her the year she turned 25, 2 months before the accident. 3 sentences in his handwriting, which was compressed and neat and used capital letters in the middle of words, where they didn't belong, a quirk she had teased him about. She put the card aside. She would give it to Sandra's document examiner later. She would use it to prove her father's handwriting when Diane's attorney produced whatever fabricated letter they had decided to produce. Because she was fairly certain now that they would. The call from Carol Whitfield came on a Tuesday morning while Nora was eating breakfast. Carol was Diane's closest friend, a woman Nora associated with school fundraisers and church casseroles, and the particular way people who have known each other for 30 years speak in a register that sounds like concern but runs on obligation. She opened with warmth and quickly moved past it. "I wanted you to know," Carol said, "how much what you're doing is hurting her. Your aunt gave up years of her life for you, Nora. She put her own plans on hold. She sacrificed, and I know that I know you remember how hard things were." A pause. "I hope you've thought carefully about what you're doing to her." Nora set down her coffee cup. "Did she ask you to call me?" A brief silence. "She's devastated. I'm calling because I'm her friend," Nora said. "She managed an estate I was never allowed to see the documents for. I found that out last month along with a few other things. I have an attorney handling it now. If Diane wants to communicate, she can do it through counsel." She hung up gently, not angrily. There was nothing to be angry at Carol about except that she had let herself be used, which was something that happened to people who trusted the wrong person, and Nora had done it for 6 years, so she wasn't in a strong position to judge. Diane called that same afternoon. Nora watched the screen ring for several seconds, then sent it to voicemail. The message was 4 minutes long. She played it once, standing in her kitchen. Diane's voice moved through several registers: warmth, then hurt, then something that presented itself as weariness and carried an undertone of warning. She talked about what she had given up to be there for Nora during the hardest years of her life. She talked about the fees every year she had worked hard to minimize the estate's expenses. The fees were for accounting and legal review and management, and anyone who did this work knew that these things cost money. She talked about how alone Nora had been, how young, how incapable. She said incapable very softly, like a diagnosis rather than a judgment. She talked about the phone call from some stranger who clearly doesn't have your best interests at heart, meaning Caleb. Her voice broke convincingly in the last minute. She said she hoped Nora would remember everything she had done for her before she let herself be turned against family. Nora forwarded the voicemail to Sandra. Sandra texted back within the hour. Interesting that she left that on record. Her attorney is not controlling her communications. Save everything. Brett's formal email arrived 2 days later. 3 paragraphs of careful language about mutual respect and different directions and wishing her well. It was clean and considerate and utterly without grief. She read it twice and felt nothing that surprised her, which was its own kind of information. She replied one line. "Thank you." She didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else to say. That weekend, Caleb came by with coffee and a folder of additional county records. She had become accustomed to this, the way he showed up with information, rather than opinion, with something concrete he had found, rather than a theory about how she should feel. She let him in, and they sat at her kitchen table, which was the first time he had been in her apartment. He did not comment on the apartment, which was small and neat, and had a wall of bookshelves she'd built herself with brackets from the hardware store. He just put the folder on the table and let her open it. It was a county deed history for the property adjacent to her family's address, the house Diane had sold. The initial sale entry she already knew, $285,000. Below it was a second entry, 18 months later. The same property resold for $385,000, a profit of $100,000 in a year and a half. She looked at the dates. The resale had happened when Nora was in her second year of working full-time, paying rent on her own apartment, operating entirely on the version of her financial reality that Diane had constructed for her. She bought it to resell it, Nora said. She wasn't just taking the money from the sale. She was also capturing the resale margin. That's what the records show. She stopped. She had been about to say premeditated, but she already knew it was premeditated. She had known since the nursing note. She had just not had this particular piece confirmed until now. She had a plan. The deed history also shows she transferred the property to an LLC a month after the initial sale. The LLC is registered to her and Ray jointly. The resale went through the LLC. Nora thought about what that meant. About the structures Diane had built the LLC, the trust management fees, the power of attorney. These were not the actions of someone who had stumbled into mismanagement. This was architecture. She photographed the deed history and texted it to Sandra with a note explaining what it showed. Sandra replied, "This establishes premeditation and benefit extraction beyond the trust. It's significant. It also explains why she needed the POA when she did. She had the resale buyer already lined up. That meant someone had contacted Diane before her mother's death with an offer on the property, which meant Diane had started planning this while Nora Callahan was still alive." Nora set the folder down carefully. She thought about Diane at her mother's hospital bedside, warm and dependable, always there. What had she been thinking? What had she been measuring? "Sandra's going to need this," Nora said. "Already sent her a copy," Caleb said. "Came from the same public records database. There's no chain of custody issue." Nora looked at him. He was drinking his coffee like this was a normal morning. "You've been building this case for a while. I've been making sure you had what you needed," he said. "There's a difference." She nodded slowly. There was. That evening, Sandra called. Her voice was level, which was how Nora had learned to tell when something had changed. "Diane's attorney filed a preemptive statement with the probate court," Sandra said. "It claims that your father, before the accident, verbally agreed to transfer the house to Diane as compensation for her anticipated care of your family. The statement includes what they are presenting as a handwritten letter from your father, dated 2 weeks before the accident, that purports to document this agreement." Nora was quiet for a moment. "A letter?" Yes, she thought about the birthday card in her folder. The compressed handwriting with the capital letters in the wrong places. "He didn't write it," she said. "I would expect you to say that." "I know. But Sandra, he didn't write it. Send me a copy." Sandra emailed it. Nora opened it and read it once. She had read hundreds of words her father had written. Notes cards, a journal she had found in a box after the accident letters to her mother. She knew the handwriting, not just the shapes of the letters, but the rhythm of it, the way he put spaces between words, the way he punctuated. She knew that when he was being careful, his letters leaned slightly right. She knew that when he was writing quickly, the capital G looked like a rounded rectangle. The letter was signed with a signature that had none of those things. "That's a forgery," she said. "I believe you," Sandra said. "Now we have to prove it." The forensic document examiner was a retired FBI analyst named George Walcott, who now consulted privately, mostly for attorneys on will contests and fraud cases. Sandra had worked with him twice before. He charged accordingly. Nora provided authenticated samples, the birthday card from her father, a signed insurance form from 5 years prior, 2 notarized affidavits he had signed in connection with a property matter, and 6 pages from the journal. Walcott reviewed everything over 10 days and sent Sandra a preliminary report. The report was 14 pages. Nora read the executive summary, which Sandra had pulled to the front, in comparing the signature on the contested letter to 4 authenticated signature samples, provided the examiner identifies inconsistencies in 4 specific characteristics. Pen pressure gradient loop formation in letters L and H spacing pattern between first name and surname and the terminal stroke of the capital C in Callahan. Preliminary conclusion: the signature on the contested letter is not a match to the authenticated signature samples. Full analysis pending final report. Sandra called after Nora had read it. "That's good," she said. "It's preliminary and Bremer will cross-examine him, but Walcott is credible and thorough. If the final report holds, we have a document that purports to be from Patrick Callahan that is inconsistent with his actual handwriting. That's forgery. That's criminal." "When's the hearing? 3rd week of November. That gives us about 5 weeks. Sandra paused. "There's one more thing. A woman named Joyce Tanner contacted us. Nora didn't recognize the name. She was a bookkeeper at the trust management services firm that Diane used for the first 3 years of the trusteeship. She left when she began to have concerns about the fee billing structure. She's kept internal records." "Internal records of what?" "The fee billings from those 3 years, the ones Diane submitted through the firm for management services. According to Joyce, the fee codes were vague, and the amounts significantly above the firm's standard structure. When she raised the question internally, she was told to drop it. She left a few months later. She kept copies of the billing records." A pause. "She said she's been following the public petition filing, and she can't stay quiet anymore." Nora sat with that. A bookkeeper who had noticed something wrong 3 years ago and kept copies on the possibility that someone would eventually ask. "What do the records show?" Year 1, 44,000 in fees. Year 2, 46,000. Year 3, 48. Industry standard for a trust of this size is between 3,000 and 5,000 annually. If we extrapolate the pattern over 6 years, Sandra stopped doing the math out loud because Nora could do it herself. That was roughly $270,000 in excess fees over 6 years against a $410,000 trust, plus the home sale, plus the resale margin. She drained almost everything Nora said. "We'll know the exact figure when the court-appointed accountant goes through the full records," Sandra said. "But yes, that's what it looks like." The week before the hearing, Nora spent 2 evenings at Sandra's office writing out her account. Sandra called it a testimony narrative, the sequence of what Nora knew when she knew it, what she was told, and what she never received. It took 12 pages. Nora had not expected it to take 12 pages. But once she started listing the specific things, the documents she'd never been sent, the explanations she'd accepted, the annual summaries that looked official and contained information she hadn't known to question, the list kept going. She sent the final version to Sandra at 10:30 on a Thursday night. Sandra replied within 20 minutes. "This is exactly what I needed. You're going to do fine." Then the Saturday before the hearing at 9 at night, Nora's phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't have saved. The text contained no introduction. It said, "She was already talking about the house before your parents' accident. 14 months before. I have the emails, J." Nora read it twice. Then she screenshotted it and called Sandra. Sandra answered on the second ring. Nora read her the text. "J," Sandra said. "Joyce Tanner." A pause. "If she has emails from Diane discussing the house 14 months before the accident, that changes the nature of this significantly. She was planning it before they died," Nora said. She said it quietly. She had known this was possible. The timing of the resale buyer, the speed with which the estate had been organized, the POA that had been ready and waiting when her mother was too sedated to know what day it was. But there was a difference between knowing it was possible and having someone say, "I have the emails." "Send me her number," Sandra said. "I'll talk to her tonight." Nora sent it. She sat on her couch in the dark for a while after. She thought about the timeline 14 months before. Her parents had been alive 14 months before. They had been driving to visit a friend in the Blue Ridge Mountains the night of the accident, taking a road they had taken many times. Her mother had been 2 months from a diagnosis that would eventually bring her to palliative care. Diane had known about the diagnosis before Nora did. Sandra Callahan had told her sister first, and while her sister was alive, receiving a diagnosis, managing it, with the quiet pragmatism of a woman who dealt with things squarely, Diane had apparently been emailing someone about the house. Nora thought about that. She thought about how you lived with someone knowing that, and what you would have to tell yourself to keep living with it. She thought about the warmth Diane brought to every room, the dependability, the way she showed up. Was it real? Had any of it been real, or was presence a strategy too? She didn't have an answer. She thought she probably never would, which was a different kind of grief than the one she had been carrying. She picked up her phone. She almost called Caleb. She looked at the time, almost 11. She set the phone down. In the morning, she would go over the final preparation with Sandra. In 6 days, she would sit in a courtroom and tell the truth about everything she had been told and everything she had not been told, and then she would let the process run. She had done what she could. The rest was about showing up and saying it clearly. She was good at showing up. She had been doing it her whole life, even when the rooms weren't good rooms. This one would be. The Richmond County Probate Court was on the 5th floor of the county judicial building, a room with high windows and wooden benches, and a flag in the corner that had been there long enough to be slightly faded. Judge Patricia Elmore had been on the bench 11 years. Sandra had appeared before her twice. She described her as demanding, detail-oriented, and impatient with argument that wasn't grounded in evidence. They arrived 45 minutes early. Nora had dressed carefully, a gray blazer and dark trousers, the same outfit she wore for presentations at work. She had not tried to look a particular way. She had tried to look like herself, which she was realizing was something she had not always done. Carl Bremer arrived with Diane's legal team 8 minutes later. Bremer was in his late 50s, suited with the intentionality of someone who understood that rooms like this one made assessments before the first word was spoken. He acknowledged Sandra across the room with a professional nod. He did not acknowledge Nora. Diane came in behind him. She wore a dark blue dress and sensible heels, and an expression of composed injury, the exact expression Nora would have predicted. She did not look at Nora. She sat down beside her attorney and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the front of the room. Ray was not there. His attorney had filed a notice of appearance but did not attend the hearing, a detail that Sandra noted, and that seemed to land as information for Bremer as well, though he showed nothing. The hearing began at 9. Bremer opened first. He was skilled and efficient. He laid out a version of the 6 years that made Diane sound like a volunteer firefighter. A woman who had stepped into a vacuum, learned quickly, made defensible decisions, administered a complex estate under difficult circumstances, and was now being accused of fraud by a grieving niece who had been contacted by a third party with undisclosed motivations. He mentioned Caleb without naming him twice. Sandra's opening was shorter. She said this is about fiduciary duty and documented fraud. She said the evidence will speak to specifics. She did not mention the wedding. Joyce Tanner testified first. She was composed and specific. She had worked at the trust management firm for 14 months. She had flagged the fee codes as irregular after the second quarterly billing. She had been told by her manager to leave it alone. She had left a few months later and kept copies of the internal records. She had not known what to do with them until the probate petition was filed. Bremer cross-examined her for 20 minutes. He established that she had left the firm under circumstances she described as voluntary resignation. He asked whether she had any professional certification. She said she did not. She was a bookkeeper, not a CPA. He thanked her and sat down. Sandra redirected. Did the billings you observed conform to the industry standard for trust management fees on a trust of this size? No, Joyce said. They were 8 to 12 times the industry standard. And in your professional experience, what explains that kind of variance? In my professional experience, Joyce said carefully, it indicates that the fee codes are being used to extract funds from the trust, rather than document legitimate services. Bremer objected. The judge overruled. George Walcott testified next. He walked through the document examination in precise, unhurried detail. He had been an FBI analyst for 22 years. He had analyzed thousands of questioned documents. He explained the 4 specific inconsistencies between the signature on the contested letter and the authenticated samples, and he explained why those inconsistencies in combination led to his preliminary conclusion of non-match. Bremer's cross-examination was pointed. He questioned whether 4 inconsistencies constituted a definitive conclusion, and Walcott said clearly that his preliminary report stated it was a non-match based on these characteristics, and that his final report would be delivered the following week. He said preliminary in a way that made clear he expected the final report to hold. Bremer also challenged the scope of the authenticated samples. Walcott listed them: birthday card insurance forms, notarized affidavits, and journal pages. 6 independent authenticated samples, he said, all consistent with each other. None consistent with the contested document. Nora was called after the morning recess. She sat in the witness chair and looked at Judge Elmore, who looked back at her with the focused attention of someone who had heard a lot of testimony and understood the difference between prepared testimony and lived experience. Sandra's questions were straightforward and chronological. What had Nora been told about the estate? She described the kitchen table conversation, the assurance that there was almost nothing left. What documents had she been provided? The annual summaries, she listed them. Had she received the original trust instrument? No. Had she ever been provided the POA document she had apparently authorized by signature? She had signed a stack of papers in the first weeks. She had not received copies of everything she had signed. Had she ever reviewed the trust's governing documents? She had not known they existed as a separate instrument. She had not known to ask for them. Sandra asked her to describe the call where Diane asked, "Who told you that?" Nora described it in exact words as best she could remember them. Ms. Callahan, Sandra said, "At the time your mother died, where was she?" "St. Mary's Hospital, palliative care floor." "She'd been there about 2 weeks. Was she aware of her surroundings?" "Toward the end, no. She was heavily sedated. She didn't always know where she was or what day it was." Nora looked at the judge when she said this. She was comfortable, but she wasn't. She didn't understand what was happening around her most of the time. Bremer's cross-examination ran 40 minutes. He asked whether Nora had professional expertise in trust administration. She said no. He asked whether she had ever requested the trust documents from Diane. She said she hadn't known she needed to request them. He asked whether she had been in contact with the person who provided the initial documents prior to receiving them. She said she had not had contact with Caleb Denton in 2 years prior to the morning of her wedding day. He asked whether she thought it was possible that a person who was upset about losing a business contact might take action to interfere in an established relationship. Sandra objected. Sustained. Bremer tried a different route. Was Nora aware of the relationship between Caleb Denton and the property adjacent to her family's address? She said yes. He found the deed through a county record search on adjacent property for a development project. That's public record. He asked whether she had verified this independently. She said Sandra Webb had. The afternoon session brought Ray Hayes into the room for the first time, not in person, but through his attorney's submission. The filing was brief. Ray confirmed he had co-signed documents presented to him by Diane as routine trust administration. He had not been informed they involved an unusually large fee structure or a contested power of attorney. He provided the dates and document types he had signed. He could not speak to his wife's intent. Bremer requested a continuance to respond to Ray's filing. Judge Elmore denied it. She reviewed the exhibits, the medical records, Joyce's billing documents, Walcott's preliminary report, Ray's filing, Nora's testimony, with the deliberate attention of someone who charged herself with getting things right. Then she spoke. She found the evidence sufficient to establish a material question of fact regarding whether the power of attorney executed under Diane Hayes's authority was validly obtained. She found the medical records in conjunction with the expert testimony established grounds to challenge the POA's validity. She found the billing records in conjunction with industry standards established a pattern of unusual fee extraction. She found the preliminary forensic report sufficient to refer the question of the contested letter to a further evidentiary hearing. She ordered the trust frozen immediately pending a full accounting by a court-appointed CPA. She advanced the matter to a full evidentiary hearing for the following quarter, and she ordered that the forensic findings regarding the contested letter be transmitted to the county district attorney's office for review of potential fraud. She did not raise her voice during any of this. She simply stated it clearly and then moved on to the next matter on her docket. Nora stepped out of the courthouse into afternoon light. The sky was the particular clear blue of November, the kind that came after a cold front moved through and left the air clean and sharp. She could hear traffic. She could hear pigeons on the courthouse steps. Sandra appeared beside her. That went well, she said, which for Sandra was effusive. Bremer's team came out a few minutes later. Diane walked past without looking at Nora. She walked with the same composure she had carried into the room, which would have looked like dignity, except that Nora knew now what was underneath it. Nora watched her go. Her phone lit up with a text from Caleb. How did it go? She typed back, "The trust is frozen. They're referring the letter to the DA." 3 dots appeared then. She looked at the courthouse behind her, at the carved inscription above the door, something about justice and law that she had not had time to read on the way in. She read it now. Then she went down the steps toward where she'd parked. The air was cold, and she didn't have a coat. She didn't mind. The county records office opened at 8:30. Nora arrived at 8:40 with a coffee she hadn't finished, and the address Caleb had texted her the night before. It was a different branch than the one where she had pulled the estate records. This one was in the older part of the building, the kind of institutional room where the fluorescent lights were slightly yellowed, and the clerk at the front desk had been doing this job long enough to know that the computer system was easier than it looked once you'd been shown the right way around it. The clerk knew Caleb. He had been in here enough times this year on the development project that she greeted him by the case number before he said it. Caleb pulled the record on a terminal near the window. He stepped back so Nora could stand in front of the screen. It was a Richmond County Fire Department Civic Commendation log, dated 22 years ago. The entries were typed in the standard format of the period date incident classification address names. This one read, Civilian Commendation, Patrick James Callahan. Assisted in extrication of 2 occupants from vehicle fire Route 60 westbound. Commended for courage and quick action. Public ceremony declined by commendee. Public ceremony declined by commendee. Nora read it twice. Then she looked at the date. 22 years ago, she would have been 10. She would have been in 5th grade. Her father would have been 38, the same age Caleb was now. He pulled 2 people out of a burning car, she said. Yes. On Route 60. The incident report is in the next file. Caleb leaned forward and navigated to it. The full incident report gave more detail: single vehicle fire following a collision, both occupants trapped. Civilian who happened to be driving past stopped, broke the driver's side window, extricated both occupants before the fire reached the cabin. Occupants sustained injuries but survived. Civilian declined to give full statement to press. Her father had broken a car window with his hands and pulled 2 people out of a burning vehicle, and then declined to speak to the press about it. "He never told me this," she said. "He never told anyone." "No," Caleb said. "He didn't." She looked at the record for a while. She thought about the man. She remembered the compressed handwriting with the wrong capitals, the newspaper habit, the way he described everything in the most practical terms available, the evenings he sat with her and worked through whatever she was struggling with in school and made it seem like a solvable problem because in his experience most things were. He had been matter-of-fact about nearly everything. He had apparently been matter-of-fact about this. "How did you find this?" she said. "I was in the adjacent property records for the development project, and I ended up in a broader county search. I found his name in a commendation cross-reference." He paused. "I was looking at what he was, not what she said about what he left." Nora thought about Diane at the kitchen table, the explanation of the estate. The debts and the complications and the legal fees and the almost nothing. The estate of a man who had done quiet good and kept nothing back for himself, described as a liability. His house described as a convenience. She thought about the word almost. Diane had never said nothing. She had always said almost nothing. The $47,000 was the remainder, the part that would have looked suspicious if it were completely gone. The almost was the only piece of the fiction that told the truth. She took a photograph of the commendation on her phone. Then she requested a certified copy from the clerk, who printed it out in the standard format and stamped it and told her it would be ready in 20 minutes. She and Caleb sat in the waiting chairs near the window while it processed. Outside, the morning was moving in the way mornings moved in mid-December. People walking fast, breath visible, a delivery truck making stops with its hazards on. "The proceedings are going to take time," she said. "Sandra says probably a year before we know what recovery looks like." "I know." "The DA referral could go longer than that." "I know." She looked at him. He was holding his coffee with both hands, watching the street outside. He had the kind of patience that wasn't the same as passivity. It was the patience of a person who understood that good things required duration and was not frightened by that. "I'm not ready to figure out anything else yet," she said. "I know that too." "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. The clerk called her name. She went to the counter and picked up the certified copy of her father's commendation and folded it carefully and put it in her bag beside everything else she was carrying. The estate documents, the hearing notes, the forensic report summary, all the things that had accumulated over the past 3 months while she was finding out what had been taken from her and what had always been there. She walked out of the county records office into a morning that was not resolved. The trust was frozen, not returned. The DA referral was initiated, not concluded. The full accounting was beginning, not finished. There was a lot of waiting still ahead, the slower administrative kind of waiting that did not announce its end date. But she knew things now that she had not known. She knew her parents had built a life worth stealing. She knew her mother had not signed the house away. She knew her father had pulled 2 strangers out of a burning car on a road in Virginia and then driven home and made dinner and not mentioned it, because in his understanding, that was what you did when something needed doing. She knew that what had been taken from her was not just money. It was the accurate story of where she came from. And she had found it. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, feeling the cold. Caleb came out the door behind her and stood a few feet away and waited. She had spent 2 years believing she had nothing. She had spent 6 years believing she had come from loss. She had spent the past 3 months learning that both of those beliefs had been manufactured by someone who needed her to be small enough to manage. She had not been small enough in the end. She put her bag over her shoulder and started walking. Caleb fell into step beside her. Neither of them said anything, which was fine. There would be time for the rest of it, the long process, the recovery, the conversations about what came after. There would be time. For now, she just walked. She carried the commendation in her bag, and she walked forward into the morning, and for the first time in a very long time, the starting point was accurate. If this story moved, you drop a comment below. What do you think Nora should do next? And if you've ever had to fight for the truth about your own family, we'd love to hear from you.